Thanks so much for coming. I'm super excited to share my story. So let me go ahead and get started. So when I was a child, my own mother had told me that if I hadn't been adopted, I'd probably be banging a can in the rice fields. She also said that I was probably a product of a prostitute. My other people have told me that I should be so lucky because the American soldiers saved my life. And then I've also been told, because I came from Vietnam, that when I see a Vietnam veteran, I should walk up to them and tell them, thank you for my life. Now, these are things that people have said to me throughout at different times in my life, and it's a heavy, heavy burden for someone who's just trying to live their life under circumstances that they had no power or no control over. But people have a tendency, particularly with adoptees, to be very outward and forward, and those are some of the things that I was told throughout my life. So let me back up a little bit. Back in 1975, Gerald Ford had sanctioned this humanitarian mission to get the kids out. The concern was that the Viet Cong, particularly if these children were mixed race, they would not be kind to these children, and that potentially their lives were in danger. And so that was the whole thought process, was to get them out of the country. So the inaugural flight was a military mission. It was a gigantic C-5A. If anybody has familiarity with military planes, it's basically a gigantic cargo plane. And what it does is there's a whole bottom open section cargo area, and you can put vehicles in it, you can put artillery in it, and then the top is like a troop compartment. So about 300 folks showed up on the tarmac in Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and then they started filling up this aircraft. So the older children were kind of on the bottom. There's like these like areas where it's like a catty-walk kind of a thing. So some of the children sat along there. They're all in the actual cargo area. And then up in the troop compartment is where they put the youngest children. So they literally carried some of these children. There's like a ladder that goes straight up, and they had to like send each child up, the youngest ones, up into that top portion. And then they put 3 babies to a seat. And that was how they filled the plane. So it was mass chaos. There were escorts that had arrived, as well as having all of these about 300 children on board. So the plane took off, and then about 15 minutes into it, there was what's called a rapid decompression. So in one of these planes, they have this big cargo door, and then that comes up, and then there's these doors that go around it. Those doors blew off, and then they had to turn around and try to make it back to Tan Son Nhut. So these Air Force pilots were just young captains, probably in their early 30s at the latest. And they came back and they were headed towards Tan Son Nhut. Unfortunately, they didn't make it. And then they hit the rice field, bounced back up, and then came back down and crashed into the rice paddy. So the plane broke into its major components. So you had the troop compartment that I explained, they kind of went into one section, the cockpit went into another, but that cargo area was hollow. And as a result of that, it ended up compressing and basically obliterating, and most of the fatalities occurred there. So there were about 178 fatalities of about 300 folks that were on that plane. So my parents always believed that I was on that plane. And so that was the story that my whole life, so that was the foundation of my life and my story. And it created a lot of pressure and a lot of intensity to live a life that was extraordinary. So from there, I went ahead and, I went to college. I had all these wonderful, great opportunities. And then after college, I was like, you know what? I want to write about Operation Babylift. And so I started doing some research, and this was way back in 1997 when the internet was just in its infancy. So I put in Operation Babylift into the search engine at the time, and then an article popped up about Regina Auney, and it was called "The Lady is a Tiger." And she was the medical crew director on that flight. And I thought, this might be my first opportunity to learn a little bit about my own history. So I went through the author. Come to find out, she was in South Carolina, and I was in the DC area at the time. So after a few misses, we finally were able to connect. We had an amazing conversation, and she was coming back up into the DC area. So we met for the first time, and it was life-changing. She was able to tell me more about Operation Babylift, what it was like that day. She had memorabilia, she had articles, and this was the first time I was able to start putting pieces of my history together. It was a really beautiful experience. So we forged a very close relationship over the next 25 years. She and I ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is kind of ironic and serendipitous because of all the places. We were both sort of East Coast, ended up in New Mexico, and our relationship became closer and closer. She was stationed there and I was stationed there too. So after about 15 years, we decided we should write a book. And so we set out to do that. Our goal was the 40th anniversary of Operation Babylift. And the goal and the storytelling was her story of Operation Babylift, my story of Operation Babylift, and then how our lives forged together and how we continued on. And that was the whole premise of the book. And we wrote that book about 10 years ago. And it was amazing. And I'm so glad that we had that opportunity. Part of the book, and one of the most important aspects of it, was we felt like we really needed to go back to Vietnam. So here we were both pilgriming back to Vietnam. Me for the first time since I was a baby. This was a completely foreign experience to me. She hadn't been back since the accident. And so that was, we had that experience together. When I went back, it was intense to be in a country that is your own, but you do not belong to it. And what I understood in that moment was that two things could live in the same place. I could be proudly American, and I could also be very proudly Vietnamese. So that was my experience leaving and after my first visit for the 40th anniversary. So after that, a couple of years later, I decided that I wanted to pay it forward. And so I decided at 44 to adopt 3 children out of foster care. So I wanted to give my children the opportunity that I have been given of just education and, just beautiful experiences. But their adoption experience is very, very different than mine. They came from foster care. I came from this international adoption experience. What's very interesting, and it's not uncommon, is that for me, I am Vietnamese. My parents are white. My children are white. So for me, I think I identify, and it was just the way that it worked out. But I have 3 beautiful children, and I made sure that they understood that they never, ever have to feel thankful to me for me being their mother. So I remind them all the time, you should be thankful for all the things in life, but you don't have to be thankful for what I did for you because that wasn't of your choice. So much so that my middle child always says, whenever I'm getting frustrated, I'm like, this is so much to be a single mom with these 3 children. She goes, well, you chose it. And she's not wrong. I did. I chose it. So I've had this beautiful experience. I've had them now for almost 7 years. We adopted in the middle of COVID in 2020. And I wouldn't change anything in the world, but it's not an easy ride by any stretch of the imagination. So Regina and I continue to tell stories. So I am very familiar with telling my story. I've done this in lots of different venues. I've not done it this quite impromptu, which is kind of fun. I wanted to stretch myself and tell the story, but kind of add some new elements. And I've done lots of speaking engagements together. And what I found is that I loved telling my story. I wrote the book and I thought that was going to be the pinnacle, but actually telling the story and having the interactions with people and meeting Vietnam vets and seeing for them that for my role and my ability to tell the story was very full circle for them. I think a lot of them struggled with understanding their role in the war. And when they saw me as an accomplished adult who was very appreciative of everything that I had, I think it helped them heal as much as it was helping me heal. So that was kind of a really cool byproduct from the experience. So just like the Porch Live, I realized how valuable stories were. And so when I learned about this opportunity and I learned about the Porch Live, I was like, I want to tell my story because I think sharing in our stories and doing something just like this event, it's beautiful. And it's just one of my favorite things. So 40th anniversary passed, and that was a whole 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. And Regina actually passed away 2 years ago. And it has been a heavy, heavy weight. But I'm so glad that we wrote the book together. She's forever a piece and part of me. And then last year was our 50th anniversary. So lots of adoptees like myself, we all pilgrimed back to Vietnam. And it was a completely different experience the second time around. I went in large part to honor Regina. I wanted to honor all of whom were a part of my story and how I was able to come here. The interesting thing about this particular trip is that I decided I was going to do birth family search. And before this, I kind of built in the narrative and belief that I didn't need it. I had my adoptive parents. It wasn't something that was necessary. But at 51, I was like, hey, time is running out. And other adoptees were finding birth parents. And I thought, if I'm going to throw a dart at the board, let's do it now. So I went back with that intention. Took part in some of the ceremonies, but also my goal was to just start a birth family search. So I started it, and I had an interpreter with me. We went to lots of different places, but basically it was like a needle in a haystack. I was going to have to like canvass people on the street because my paperwork is not accurate in any way, shape, or form, and that is war. So I actually traveled on a paperwork of 2 children before me. The nun who chose me for my parents actually died on the C5 crash, so all of my ancestors died with her. And so I don't even know my actual birth date. So I traveled on this other person's paperwork, and ultimately, it was a matter of just being able to talk to people on the street. Maybe somebody knew something. Where my orphanage is no longer. They tore it down because of their work with the Americans, and now it's a government building. But we started talking to folks on the street, and what happened, was completely unexpected for me. I would talk with these strangers through my interpreter and tell them my story, and they looked and they would be like, talk a little bit like, yeah, we remember when the nuns were here, and but they didn't have a lot of information. And in a couple instances, the look on their face was something I wasn't expecting. It was straight pity. They looked at me with sadness of, wait, hold on, you're looking for family, you've left the country, you don't know any of your family, you don't know any of your information. And I was like, no, I don't know anything. And for the first time in my life, I never imagined that I would be meeting strangers on the street who would see something in my story that I didn't even see. And what it is my whole entire life, people had told me I had to be thankful. And this was the first opportunity where I was able to see and to feel like it was okay for me to acknowledge the fact that I lost something too. I lost my history. I lost family. I don't even know my actual birth date. And so again, in that belief of like 2 things can live in the same space, I could be very appreciative of the life I have and also recognize that I had a whole lot of loss. So a couple of years ago, or like not too long ago, I came across this story, and it was about kintsugi. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of taking broken pieces and putting it back together with gold. And the whole idea of it is that it's stronger and it's more beautiful afterwards. And I will say right now, life is hard. My family and I, we're having this is an intense season for us. And I would say that we are broken pieces. But I also know that we're going to come together, and we're going to be mended, and we're going to have just this beautiful space. And in that place, 2 things will still be true. We're going to be broken and beautiful. Thanks, everybody.